A lie doesn't collapse when it's challenged. It collapses when it has to keep up. Here's the part nobody tells you. Most lies don't get exposed because someone finally speaks up. They get exposed because they get tired. They start slipping. They contradict themselves. They require too much maintenance. And eventually, they miss a step in public. That's when the room goes quiet, not out of shock, but out of recognition. Because suddenly, everyone is seeing the same thing at the same time. There's an actual psychological fact behind this. Studies on deception show that liars don't fail because they forget one detail. They fail because sustaining a false narrative over time increases cognitive load. In simple terms, keeping lies straight is exhausting, especially when real life keeps happening and refuses to cooperate. Truth adjusts naturally. Lies have to be rehearsed, and sooner or later, rehearsal clashes with reality. That's exactly what's happening here. What people are witnessing right now isn't a dramatic reveal or a big announcement. It's something far more uncomfortable, a pattern breaking. A story that once sounded confident now sounds defensive. A person who once spoke freely now watches their words like they're tiptoeing through a crime scene they forgot they left footprints in. And the funniest part, yes, there is a funny part, is that they still think they're fooling everyone, while everyone is quietly exchanging the same look that says, "Oh, so that's who you are." Meanwhile, you didn't need a megaphone. You didn't need receipts taped to the internet. Life did the heavy lifting for you. Outcomes started contradicting accusations. Your stability clashed with the chaos they predicted. And without you saying much at all, the spotlight slowly rotated, not toward your defense, but toward their behavior. That's when people stop asking what happened and start noticing how often the story changes. This moment isn't about revenge, exposure, or victory laps. It's about clarity, the kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't shout, and doesn't beg to be believed. It just shows up and refuses to leave. The lie has been running on fumes and reality just pulled into the room and turned the lights on. Now everybody's blinking, and the culprit is standing exactly where the story has been pointing the whole time. Number 1. The truth didn't need your permission to surface. It needed pressure. Here's what people misunderstand about how truth actually comes out. It doesn't wait for fairness. It doesn't care about timing. And it definitely doesn't wait for you to be ready. Truth shows up when a lie is forced to carry more weight than it was ever built for. That's why exposure often looks messy and unplanned. It isn't some noble reveal. It's structural failure. For a long time, the lie worked because it wasn't tested. People repeated it, defended it, and adjusted their behavior around it. But life doesn't pause to protect a narrative. Real events keep happening. New situations arise. New people enter the picture. And suddenly, the lie has to stretch to cover more ground than it can handle. That's when cracks appear. What exposed them wasn't your bravery or your voice. It was pressure. Pressure from time. Pressure from inconsistencies. Pressure from outcomes that refused to align with what was said about you. Every lie requires constant recalibration. One version for this person, another version for that room, another explanation when reality doesn't cooperate. That's exhausting. And exhaustion makes people sloppy. Under pressure, liars overcorrect. They explain too much. They react too fast. They contradict themselves without realizing it. They become defensive in moments that don't require defense. Meanwhile, truth stays boring. It doesn't rush. It doesn't shift. It doesn't need editing. It just sits there, unchanged, while everything else starts bending around it. That's why this moment feels inevitable. Not dramatic, not loud. Inevitable. The lie reached its limit. It couldn't carry one more detail, one more situation, one more set of eyes. And when it finally buckled, people didn't gasp. They nodded. Because on some level, they had already felt the tension. They already sensed something didn't add up. This is why you didn't have to chase understanding. Pressure did the work. Reality applied weight. And once that weight crossed a certain threshold, the truth didn't need permission anymore. It surfaced on its own, not as an announcement, but as a quiet, undeniable shift in how people see everything now. Number 2. They were never exposed by facts. They were exposed by patterns. What really brings a liar down isn't a single piece of evidence or one uncomfortable conversation. It's the repetition of their own behavior, over and over, until it becomes impossible to ignore. People think exposure comes in dramatic bursts, like a bomb dropping and everyone reacting at once. That's rarely how it works. Most of the time, exposure comes quietly, in the way that patterns repeat themselves until the truth becomes obvious. It's a cumulative effect, and it's relentless. Each time they lied, twisted a story, or tried to manipulate, it added another link to a chain that was impossible to hide. At first, people might excuse it, rationalize it, or ignore it entirely. One mistake here, one exaggeration there. It's human, right? But lies are not like one-off mistakes. They are like footprints. The more they lie, the more footprints they leave behind. And eventually, someone starts noticing the same footprints appearing again and again. That's when the lie stops being plausible. Patterns are what make people uncomfortable, because they are undeniable. A single lie can be dismissed. A pattern cannot. Patterns reveal intentions, priorities, and hidden agendas. People begin connecting events, comments, and reactions, and suddenly a bigger picture emerges. The truth doesn't need to be spelled out because the consistency of deception exposes itself. Observers start piecing it together without anyone having to explain it. That's why liars panic when their patterns start being noticed. They know they can fudge a single instance, but they cannot erase years of repeated behavior. Their own predictability becomes their undoing. And the most striking part is that this pattern-based exposure doesn't rely on public arguments or social media posts. It doesn't need a speech. It doesn't need confrontation. It relies on the unchanging, undeniable repetition of what they have always done. People see the same moves, the same excuses, the same manipulations. And when that happens, the mask falls naturally. Patterns reveal the truth far more convincingly than facts alone ever could, because the lie has been living in plain sight the entire time. Number 3. Their panic comes from realizing they can't outrun their own history. The moment a liar starts unraveling, it isn't because someone pointed a finger or shouted the truth in their face. It's because they suddenly realize that their own history is catching up with them. Every lie they've told, every manipulation, every half-truth, and every cover-up is part of a timeline that cannot be erased. They begin to see that their past isn't a distant story they can control. It's a living record that other people are noticing, connecting, and understanding. History is relentless. It doesn't care about intentions or excuses. It simply exists. And when you've built a life on deception, every previous interaction, every inconsistency, and every hidden motive starts colliding with current events. The moments they thought no one was watching, or that people wouldn't remember, suddenly become glaring pieces of evidence. The panic sets in because they understand the pattern of exposure is unstoppable. It doesn't matter how clever they think they are. Their past moves are public enough for perception to shift, and once that shift begins, there's no turning it back. What terrifies them most isn't judgment, it's recognition. They panic because people are finally piecing together the full picture without anyone having to narrate it. Every lie starts to contradict the last. Every attempt to justify themselves feels thinner and more desperate. The stability they depended on begins to crumble under the weight of accumulated truth. And no amount of manipulation can rewrite the timeline they've already set in motion. This is why history is so effective. It doesn't lie, it doesn't bend, and it doesn't forget. It exposes slowly but surely, leaving the culprit floundering as they realize that everything they've tried to hide is out in the open, in the way people perceive events, behaviors, and character. Panic is natural, because they are finally facing the undeniable fact that their actions have consequences beyond their control. Their history is no longer a private shield, it's a public spotlight, illuminating the reality they worked so hard to disguise. Number 4. You didn't have to defend yourself because reality already did. The most striking part of exposure isn't always the moment someone speaks up. It's the moment reality quietly does the talking for you. You didn't have to prove anything, post evidence, or convince anyone of your truth. You simply existed, and life kept moving in a way that made your innocence impossible to ignore. While the culprit scrambled to control perception, twist narratives, and gaslight everyone around them, reality was silently aligning itself in your favor, creating a pattern that no amount of lies could erase. This is what makes exposure so devastating to liars. They spend their energy managing appearances, convincing people, and covering tracks, while you continue on your path, unaffected by their chaos. Each decision they made to manipulate situations ends up contradicting their story in front of the very audience they wanted to control. Their words may have been loud, aggressive, and rehearsed, but reality doesn't need volume. Reality works quietly but relentlessly, revealing inconsistencies, failed schemes, and outcomes that cannot be argued away. The truth has this almost surgical efficiency. It doesn't shout or make threats. It simply presents evidence through consequences, through results, through the natural order of what happens when deception meets life's unyielding logic. People start noticing details that no one pointed out, timelines that don't match, actions that don't add up, promises that never came true. Slowly, without any dramatic intervention on your part, the mask starts to slip. Others begin connecting the dots themselves, often without even realizing they are doing it. This is why they panic. It isn't because you attacked them or revealed secrets. It's because reality exposed their inconsistencies far more convincingly than any argument ever could. Their narrative, meticulously crafted over time, begins to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. And the most remarkable part is that all you had to do was continue living honestly, calmly, and consistently. Your truth didn't need defending. It simply needed to exist, and that existence did all the work for you. The liar is left exposed, frantic, and increasingly desperate, while everyone else quietly sees the reality they can no longer hide from. Number 5. They mistook your restraint for weakness and paid for it publicly. One of the biggest mistakes a liar makes is underestimating the power of restraint. They assume that if you stay quiet, if you don't react, if you don't argue back, it's because you are weak or defeated. They read calm as compliance, patience as passivity, and silence as submission. That assumption is exactly what gives restraint its quiet power. By holding back, by refusing to engage in their chaos, you create a space where their lies have nowhere to land and no support to lean on. While they are frantic, over-explaining, and defending themselves with increasing desperation, your restraint allows observers to see the contrast clearly. People notice the difference between someone scrambling to be believed and someone calmly letting life expose the inconsistencies. Each overreaction, each unnecessary explanation, each flustered denial becomes a piece of evidence against them. Your quiet endurance doesn't just highlight their lies, it amplifies them. What they think is your weakness turns into a mirror, reflecting back every flaw in their story in stark detail. Restraint also carries its own subtle authority. It says without words that you don't need to fight to be seen or understood. It signals stability, clarity, and confidence, the kind that doesn't bend under pressure. Observers Start to see not only the liar's desperation but also the strength in your composure. The contrast is unmistakable. One person floundering to control perception, the other existing in alignment with reality. That disparity is powerful. It shifts attention, credibility, and ultimately judgment, without you having to lift a finger. In the end, their public unraveling isn't because you attacked or exposed them directly. It's because they mistook your restraint for vulnerability. They assumed you were powerless to affect the narrative, only to realize too late that your silence was stronger than any argument. The more they struggled to prove themselves, the more they revealed their own fragility. By the time the truth became obvious to everyone, it was clear. Their collapse was entirely self-inflicted, while your quiet strength became the lens through which everyone finally saw reality. Number 6. What finally exposed them was how aggressively they needed to control the narrative. One of the most revealing signs of a liar isn't the lie itself. It's the desperation to control how the story is told. The more someone tries to manipulate perception, the more obvious it becomes that they are hiding something. People who are confident in the truth don't need to micromanage reactions, explanations, or opinions. They don't feel the constant urge to correct every detail or preemptively defend themselves. The moment you see someone obsessively controlling the narrative, it's a flashing red warning that everything they're presenting is fragile, unstable, and dependent on everyone else believing it without question. Desperation to control is revealing because it exposes insecurity. When someone is lying, they understand deep down that a single misstep could unravel everything. So, they overcompensate. They explain too much, repeat their points, over-justify, and attack even the smallest doubts. They become performative, frantic, and loud in ways that are almost comical to an outside observer, but deadly effective at exposing their own instability. It's like watching someone trying to hold a collapsing structure together with duct tape. It only highlights how weak the foundation really is. This behavior also alerts others to inconsistencies they might have overlooked. When a liar over-explains, contradicts, or pushes their version of events too aggressively, it draws attention to the places where reality and their story don't match. People start noticing the gaps, the repeated exaggerations, and the actions that don't align with words. That overzealous control intended to protect them ends up being the very thing that exposes them. The irony is brutal. The more they try to keep everyone on their side, the faster they unravel. Every effort to dominate perception creates tension, contradictions, and overexposure. Meanwhile, the truth doesn't need micromanagement. It just exists and gradually aligns with outcomes, behaviors, and patterns, revealing the liar for exactly who they are. The desperate need to control the narrative doesn't save them. It is what finally forces the mask to slip, letting everyone see the person behind it, completely unguarded. Number 7. They lost credibility the moment they needed you to stay small. Nothing exposes a liar faster than when their story only works if someone else remains diminished. The second they start requiring you to shrink, to stay quiet, or to appear flawed, they hand everyone the blueprint to their manipulation. It's a silent admission. The narrative isn't true on its own. It relies entirely on controlling perception. And people notice. Observers pick up on this almost instinctively. When a person's credibility depends on someone else being less than, it tells the world far more about them than anything you could say. The liar assumes that by keeping you small, they protect the story they've built. They think that if you don't speak, if you don't defend yourself, and if you don't shine, people will automatically believe the version of events they are selling. But this is the moment their credibility begins to crumble. The moment your growth, clarity, or calmness becomes inconvenient to their narrative, their mask starts to slip. People start questioning why the story only works when someone else is suppressed. why the blame or shame is always conveniently shifted onto you. That inconsistency speaks louder than words ever could. What's extraordinary about this kind of exposure is that it doesn't require confrontation. You didn't have to fight. You didn't have to reveal anything new. Simply existing in your integrity and refusing to be diminished forces the liar into a corner. Every desperate effort they make to maintain control, to belittle or to manipulate attention back onto you, only highlights how unstable their story has always been. Their credibility collapses quietly, subtly, but irreversibly. Once people recognize that their narrative is conditional, dependent on you staying small, they stop trusting the story altogether. And suddenly, all of their previous efforts, their carefully constructed lies, and their aggressive control tactics become transparent. What you might have thought was patience or restraint was actually a powerful act of exposure. By refusing to shrink, you didn't just protect yourself. You revealed the real character of someone who thought they could manipulate reality through your silence. Number 8. The shift happened when people realized the math wasn't mathing. The moment a liar starts to unravel is rarely dramatic. It's almost mathematical. People notice when the numbers, the timelines, the actions, and the words don't add up. At first, small inconsistencies might be brushed off, explained away, or overlooked. But over time, the accumulation of contradictions becomes impossible to ignore. It's as if reality itself is pointing out the errors, and no amount of spin, excuses, or deflection can make the story balance. That's when the shift happens. People stop blindly accepting the narrative and start noticing that the equation simply doesn't work. Lies are fragile because they rely on precision. Every detail has to fit into a constructed reality, and the more complex the lie, the harder it becomes to maintain. One misstep here, one overlooked detail there, and the whole structure starts tilting. Observers begin connecting the dots on their own. They see patterns that the liar thought would remain hidden. They notice that promises weren't kept, timelines are impossible, and explanations keep changing. The math doesn't match, and suddenly, doubt turns into recognition. The beauty of this exposure is that it doesn't require drama or confrontation. No one has to call out the liar. The evidence is quietly accumulating in plain sight, forming a pattern that contradicts their story. Every action that fails to line up with their claims adds weight to the truth. Outcomes clash with their words, predictions fail. Attempts to manipulate perception fall flat. And when people start noticing that reality isn't cooperating with the liar, the credibility they once relied on begins to crumble. This is when panic sets in. They realize that the story they carefully built can't withstand scrutiny. Not because someone proved them wrong in an argument, but because the numbers, the facts, and the patterns refuse to cooperate. The math isn't mathing, and nothing they say can make it. Meanwhile, observers see the collapse in real time, connecting the inconsistencies to form a clear picture. That is the subtle, devastating way a liar is exposed. Not through spectacle, but through the unstoppable alignment of reality against their carefully constructed fiction. Number 9. Their rage isn't about truth coming out. It's about losing authority over perception. What drives a liar into full-blown panic and anger isn't the truth itself. They don't fear reality. They fear the loss of control over how others see it. For someone who has built a life on manipulation, deception, and spinning stories, perception is everything. Their confidence, credibility, and power rely entirely on convincing people to believe their version of events. The moment that control slips, every carefully crafted defense, every rehearsed story, and every subtle manipulation starts to collapse, and rage becomes their instinctive response. Rage is revealing. It shows desperation more clearly than calm words ever could. When someone lashes out, overreacts, or attacks without logic, it's usually because they realize that the narrative they've depended on is no longer working. People begin noticing the cracks in their story, and with each reaction, the liar digs themselves deeper. What they think is intimidation and authority actually becomes evidence of instability. Their anger signals to the world that the truth is no longer under their management, that outcomes are no longer bending to match their claims. This is why observers start seeing them for what they really are. When someone's credibility depends on everyone else believing a certain way, their frustration and panic under scrutiny reveal that their version of events is fragile. They try to dominate the conversation, push their version harder, or discredit anyone questioning them. But in doing so, they broadcast their insecurity. The audience begins to understand that the story isn't built on fact, it's built on control. Meanwhile, the truth quietly moves forward without confrontation. It doesn't need loud arguments or dramatic displays. Reality is consistent. Outcomes align with actions, patterns repeat, and behaviors reveal themselves. The liar's rage only emphasizes this disparity. What was once believable becomes impossible to defend. The more they fight to control perception, the more everyone else sees the truth. And in the end, the real exposure isn't the revelation of facts. It's watching someone's authority crumble under the weight of their own desperation, leaving them exposed, frantic, and completely unmasked. Number 10. You became dangerous the moment people realized you weren't bitter. There's a unique power in surviving injustice without allowing it to twist your soul. Most people expect pain, betrayal, or mistreatment to produce bitterness. They expect you to fight back in anger, to lash out, or to behave in ways that confirm the liar's story about you. But when you refuse to play that role, when you maintain clarity, calmness, and composure, something unexpected happens. People start noticing. They begin to see that the person who should be broken is, in fact, unshakable. And that is terrifying to anyone whose credibility depends on your supposed weakness. The liar thrives on predictability. They build narratives expecting you to react, to crumble, or to validate their version of reality. When you don't, their story begins to fail. People around them start asking questions without even realizing it. They notice the inconsistencies in the liar's claims, the desperation in their tone, and the contradictions between what they say and what actually happens. Your lack of bitterness becomes a mirror, reflecting the liar's instability and making them increasingly exposed. This is where real danger lies, not for you, but for the person who underestimated your resilience. Your composure undermines their entire strategy. While they assumed emotional outbursts or visible frustration would validate their narrative, your calm existence contradicts it entirely. Observers naturally gravitate toward what feels honest, rational, and grounded. When they see you handling injustice without losing yourself, your integrity becomes a silent but powerful form of evidence against the liar. The more they try to provoke, manipulate, or control you, the more obvious it becomes that their tactics are failing. Their narrative starts collapsing under the weight of reality and your unwavering presence. Meanwhile, your reputation strengthens quietly but unmistakably. People begin to trust what they see in you over the chaos of the liar's claims. The moment you refuse to become bitter, the liar loses not just control of perception, but credibility, authority, and any illusion of superiority. Your strength becomes undeniable, and that is what makes you truly dangerous, not because you fought back, but because you refused to be anything less than yourself, leaving the liar exposed and scrambling. Number 11. The truth landed harder because it arrived without theatrics. One of the most powerful ways a lie is exposed isn't through drama, shouting, or public confrontations. It's through quiet, steady, undeniable truth. While liars rely on spectacle, chaos, and theatrics to distract and manipulate, reality doesn't need a performance. It simply exists, and over time, it aligns with outcomes, patterns, and consequences that contradict the false story. That's why when the truth finally lands, it lands harder than anything a person could announce with noise and fury. There's no exaggeration, no trying to convince anyone. Just clarity, consistency, and results speaking for themselves. Liars count on distraction to survive. They know that confusion, conflict, and emotional turbulence can keep observers from noticing the inconsistencies in their stories. They hope that by creating chaos, people will focus on everything but the truth. But when you allow reality to work without adding noise or theatrics, it cuts through all that manipulation. People begin to notice the small but undeniable facts, outcomes that contradict claims, patterns that don't align, and behaviors that reveal intentions. These moments build quietly but powerfully until the liar's carefully constructed story starts to unravel in front of everyone. The absence of theatrics doesn't make the revelation less intense. It makes it unstoppable. There's no argument to counter, no emotion to misread, and no performance to dismiss. The truth doesn't need to prove itself in words, because it proves itself in life. Observers begin to compare what they see with what they've been told, and the contradictions are glaring. The calmer the truth remains while the liar struggles to maintain their story, the more obvious the disparity becomes. This is why exposure feels inevitable and irrefutable. The liar's efforts to control perception, defend themselves, and dominate the narrative become increasingly frantic, while the truth simply persists. Its quiet, relentless consistency highlights every flaw in the false story. In the end, the liar's theatrics collapse under the weight of reality, and what remains is undeniable. The truth, arriving without fanfare, lands heavier and more convincingly than anything a liar could ever stage. Number 12. They are unraveling because people are no longer asking what happened, but who benefits. The turning point for a liar isn't always when facts are revealed. It's when people stop focusing on the story itself and start examining the motives behind it. When observers begin asking who benefits from a particular narrative, everything changes. The focus shifts from the supposed victim, the alleged events, or the dramatic storytelling, to the person orchestrating it all. Suddenly, attention moves from defending a fabricated story to analyzing why it exists, and that shift is fatal for anyone who built their credibility on deception. Lies survive on distraction. They rely on everyone paying attention to the narrative itself rather than the person behind it. But as soon as people start asking why certain claims were made, patterns of manipulation become obvious. Observers notice that the same individual always ends up looking powerful, protected, or vindicated, regardless of the chaos around them. Every inconsistent explanation, every overreaction, and every attempt to control perception starts to point back to the liar. The story no longer stands alone. It starts to reflect the manipulator who created it. What makes this kind of exposure so devastating is that it doesn't rely on confrontation or argument. People begin to see the connections on their own. They notice timelines that conveniently benefit the liar, outcomes that favor their interests, and behaviors that consistently position them as the authority or truth-teller. The question of who benefits strips away all the embellishments, defenses, and theatrics, leaving the liar exposed in a way that's undeniable. This perspective forces everyone to reassess past events through a clearer lens. Instead of simply accepting what they were told, they now analyze why the story exists in the first place, and every detail suddenly fits into a pattern of self-interest and manipulation. The liar can try to explain, distract, or gaslight, but it's too late. The audience already sees the mechanics of deception. Their unraveling is complete because the story no longer serves them. It exposes them. The focus is no longer on the narrative they constructed, but on the person behind it, and the truth of their intentions becomes impossible to ignore. Number 13. The real exposure is that they needed a villain, and you refused the role. One of the most overlooked ways a liar is exposed is through the very role they try to force onto someone else. Their story often requires a villain, someone to blame, someone to look weak, flawed, or unstable, because it makes their narrative believable. They need a character to project all their manipulations onto, and for a long time, they may assume you will fill that spot without question. But the moment you refuse to play the part they wrote for you, the story collapses under its own weight. Liars count on predictability. They assume people will react exactly as expected, defensive, angry, or broken. That reaction becomes the proof they need to validate their claims. When you refuse to conform to the role of the guilty party, the illusion they've been crafting begins to unravel. Observers start noticing that their accusations only make sense if you are somehow diminished or compromised, and once you refuse that role, the entire narrative looks fabricated. The liar becomes frantic because their plan depended on a predictable victim, and predictability is gone. Refusing the role doesn't require confrontation or drama. It doesn't require proving yourself or exposing them outright. Simply existing in your integrity, continuing to act rationally, and refusing to absorb blame is enough to disrupt the illusion. Every attempt they make to manipulate perception now backfires because the story they carefully constructed relies on a dynamic that no longer exists. People start noticing the cracks, the contradictions, and the desperation in their attempts to rewrite reality. This is why the liar's exposure is often so complete. Their power relied entirely on your cooperation, and when that cooperation is withheld, the entire charade collapses. The audience sees it clearly. The villain they tried to manufacture doesn't exist, and the person they hoped to manipulate into weakness is standing firm. Your refusal to take on the role they assigned you doesn't just protect your integrity, it exposes the liar in ways words alone could never achieve. The mask slips, the story fails, and the person behind the lies is finally visible for everyone to see. Number 14. This wasn't your redemption arc, it was their unmasking. The final truth that exposes a liar isn't about proving yourself or claiming victory. It isn't about showing that you're right or that you've survived. This is the subtle but devastating reality. What people are witnessing isn't your redemption. It's the unmasking of the person who spent so long trying to control perception. The liar's collapse isn't triggered by your words or actions alone. It's triggered by the unstoppable force of reality, clarity, and consistency, revealing them for who they really are. For years, they relied on manipulation, distortion, and the careful construction of a narrative that put them in control. They assumed that you would react as expected, that observers would believe their version, and that the truth could be bent to fit their story. But they miscalculated. They didn't anticipate that their own lies would eventually contradict themselves, that patterns of deception would emerge, and that outcomes could no longer be forced to match their claims. Every attempt to dominate perception, to gaslight, or to intimidate only accelerated their exposure. Meanwhile, you continued existing in alignment with reality. You didn't need to fight. You didn't need to shout or argue. Your life, your decisions, and your composure were enough to reveal the inconsistencies in their narrative. People began to notice the pattern, the contradictions, the desperation. Slowly, but inevitably, the mask they relied on started slipping. The facade of authority, credibility and control that they had worked so hard to maintain began to crack under the weight of its own instability. What makes this moment so powerful is that it's undeniable. Observers don't need persuasion. They see it clearly. The liar's credibility, carefully built over time, collapses because it was never anchored in truth. And while the world focuses on the unraveling of their story, it's not about you rising. It's about everyone finally seeing them exactly as they are. The unmasking is complete, and there is no going back. Their frantic attempts, their manipulations, and their lies have been exposed for all to witness. In the end, the story isn't your triumph, it's their exposure, and that reality hits harder than anything they could have anticipated. Everything we've explored here comes down to one undeniable truth. Liars aren't undone by confrontation, drama, or even the loudest voices exposing them. They are undone by the relentless, quiet force of reality itself. Patterns, contradictions, desperation, and the refusal of others to play the roles they've written all converge to reveal them exactly as they are. Every overreaction, every attempt to control perception, every effort to manipulate outcomes only accelerates the collapse because the truth has a precision that no lie can withstand. You've seen how restraint, consistency, and clarity act as weapons far more powerful than anger or aggression. By refusing to shrink, by refusing to become bitter, and by simply existing in alignment with reality, you allow the liar to expose themselves. People begin noticing inconsistencies without anyone pointing them out. Patterns emerge. Outcomes contradict stories. Control slips through their fingers, and their desperation becomes the very proof of their instability. This is the kind of exposure that doesn't rely on confrontation. It's unstoppable, quiet, and ultimately undeniable. What makes this even more extraordinary is how personal integrity becomes the ultimate instrument of truth. You don't need to fight. You don't need to persuade. You just need to exist authentically, and life will do the rest. The liar's unmasking isn't about your triumph. It's about the inevitable revelation of who they truly are when their narrative is no longer sustainable. And when the mask finally falls, everyone sees clearly, and nothing they do afterward can repair the credibility lost. This is a powerful reminder. Truth doesn't need a megaphone, reality doesn't negotiate, and patience, composure, and integrity have a weight no deception can carry. The liar's collapse is not just exposure. It is the natural consequence of building a life on falsehoods while others simply continue living their truth. If this video gave you clarity, insight, or even a sense of justice being served, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next deep dive. Smash that like button if you felt the impact, drop a comment sharing your thoughts or experiences, and share this video with anyone who needs to see the power of truth over deception. Stay grounded, stay aware, and watch as reality always finds its way. God bless you.